Good afternoon to you all, and welcome at Bruegel. Please find your seat. I think we still have some chairs available in the room. Okay. So, welcome again. My name is Simone Tagliapietra. I am a fellow of this house, and today I'm pleased to host this conversation on what I personally consider to be one of the most fascinating topics for the EU agenda in the coming 5 years, which is really the interplay of decarbonisation and industrial competitiveness. For us at Bruegel, this has long been a topic of central importance. Over the last years, we have tried to push the European debate on green industrial policy as much as we could. And this is really based on the idea that unless we are able to create clean growth and jobs, we cannot secure the political and social viability of the green transition in the long run. So getting this agenda right is fundamental to secure the viability of Europe's own decarbonization trajectory. This activity on our side intensified after, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act. After that, we have ramped up our work in the area, not only in terms of policy analysis, but also in terms of data provision. This year, we have launched European Clean Tech Tracker, which you can find in our webpage, which is a dashboard to track in a granular manner the innovation, manufacturing, and deployment trends on all the clean technologies we need for the transition. Based on this tracker, we have built with the Rhodium Group in the United States a transatlantic clean tech investment monitor to compare trends across the Atlantic. And again, you can find the first briefing, which we published just before the summer in our website. So, like many others, we have been very pleased to see this item being at the top of the agenda of Ursula von der Leyen for the new mandate. As we all know very well in this room, the President has pledged to put forward a clean industrial deal within the first 100 days of the mandate. And she said this clean industrial deal should namely focus on supporting the right conditions for companies to reach our common goals of decarbonization, resilience, and competitiveness. In this context, I think the guidelines have also been quite granular in the spelling out of the initiatives that are supposed to be promoted over the next months. The first being the Industrial Decarbonization Accelerator Act, which we might, I think, read as a Net Zero Industry Act for energy-intensive industries, because these industries are the ones that over the last years have particularly suffered, namely from the very high energy price environment we currently are in. Among the different policies that we have listed in the guidelines, I think we will have plenty of time to discuss. There is this idea of developing lead markets, which I consider to be particularly fascinating. Mario Draghi has also put forward its master plan to marry decarbonization and industrial competitiveness, and I think this matches pretty well the clean industrial deal concept itself and provides also a number of inputs to this agenda. Finally, it has not been a boring period in Brussels the last few weeks. Yesterday, we also got some clarity on the governance of the clean industrial deal. So we, of course, pending confirmation of the Parliament, we know that this initiative will be jointly coordinated by Teresa Ribera and Stéphane Séjourné, who will work on this with the Climate Commissioner and the Energy Commissioner. And this team will have many levers at their disposal to guide this initiative. competition policy, energy policy, single market rules, the ETS, the modernization fund, the innovation fund, and also the forthcoming competitiveness fund. So a comprehensive agenda, and to discuss all of this, we are lucky today to have what I consider to be really the best panel possible for this topic, composed by Kerstin Jorna, Director General of DG GROW, Kurt van der Berge, Director General of DG Klima, and Anne Mettler, Vice President Europe, Breakthrough Energy. Now, we will have a first round of intervention by our panelists, and we will then open it up to question and answer. Of course, you all in the room are welcome to ask your question, but also the ones following online, and I know are very many, can pose their question by using the hashtag on Slido CleanDeal. Kurt, maybe let me start with you, if I may, and the reason is that over the last 5 years you have been one of the main architects of the Green Deal, before being the Green Deal person in the team of the president, and then being Director General of DG Klima. Now, how do you see the clean transition progressing in Europe? Are we on track? And how do you see moving forward the interplay of the green transition and this strong industrialization agenda we currently have? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Simone, and very happy to be here this afternoon. I think what you say makes clear that the stars are aligning to make sure that we take forward the policies that we need. And I think the Draghi report that you mentioned comes at the right time, with the right messages, and with the wake-up call for those who believe we still needed a wake-up call. It's very clear, and we agree that with Mr. Draghi, that succeeding in this clean transition is existential for Europe. Not only for ecological reasons, maybe not mainly even for ecological reasons, because as Anne would definitely point out, we're only 6% of global emissions. But it's existential especially for economic reasons, because there is a global race to net zero ongoing, and it's existential for security reasons as well, because we can't remain dependent on fossil fuel imports, and we also see the effects of climate change. What is happening currently in Central and Eastern Europe, and with the wildfires in Portugal, is horrible, and that's also why climate adaptation and resilience will become increasingly important, also as a factor of competitiveness, by the way. Decarbonisation, Mr. Draghi says, can be a source of growth. Agora just published a paper earlier this week saying that achieving the 2040 target of minus 90% can lead to 2% additional growth, if well done. It can and will also be a driver of competitiveness. That's what Mr. Draghi clearly says. But he adds a very important condition to this. He says decarbonisation can and will be a driver of competitiveness if all policies are aligned. And that's, of course, a fundamental condition. And I think in that sense, the lineup of the next Commission is very good, in my view. And I'm particularly happy to be here together with Kerstin. We will be working on this very much jointly, because both agendas and that of many colleagues in the Commission depend now on our cooperation and good coordination. Maybe it's important to say that we are on track with Europe. There is a lot of gloom and doom about where we are. It's very good to say that we are on track. We have consistently decoupled our economic growth from emissions since 1990, while the rest of the world increased its emissions. In 23, we reduced emissions by 9% in 1 year. In the energy sector, power sector, minus 25% of emissions. At a time when unemployment is historically low, private sector investment is picking up. We have tripled investment in clean energy in Europe in the last 5 years, but we need much more and much quicker. Even our manufacturing index doesn't compare badly with the United States, but where we have an issue, a real worry, is the future of energy-intensive industries in Europe. They are suffering, they are hurting, not so much because of climate policy, The Bundesbank released a paper today clearly saying that climate policy and ETS has not led to carbon leakage, but obviously they are hurt by very high energy prices and by global market conditions. So what this means for us is that we need to stay the course on the Green Deal. We may paint it less in dark green, call it more clean. We will preach less and practice more, but we need to stay the course. We have the framework in place for this with Fit for 55. We see that final investment decisions for many projects are ready, but not being taken because there's still a bit of uncertainty. So the worst thing we could do is now slow down or revert. We need to pay more attention to just transition, and we need this clean industry deal. That is an absolute necessity. But it will need to be linked to our work on climate. Very much linked, as also the President said, to the 2040 target of reducing emissions by 90%. No decarbonisation without an industrial policy, but no industrial policy without this decarbonisation. The two very much go together. And there I would like to say that we really need a very good understanding and a bit of hygiene in the use of words and concepts. We talk a lot about competitiveness and industrial policy as if these are the same things. They are not. I must say I've been around now in the Commission for almost 30 years. We have been talking for 30 years about competitiveness or sustainable competitiveness. You may recall the Wim Kok report in 2005, alarm about Europe's competitiveness. And despite all this obsession, not much has improved to this. That is where the European Green Deal comes in, I believe. It is an innovation, an investment shock for our economy, a shock that we need and that we have delayed for too long. It's an economic modernization agenda. And as Jean Pisani-Ferry said it very well in the Financial Times, what we currently see is a battle between brown and green capitalism. We need to make sure the green capitalism wins and that there are as few losers as possible from the brown capitalism. What is possibly new compared to previous times is that we have China also as a big elephant factor to reckon with. So I think what it means is that we need a competitiveness policy where we look at the framework conditions for all businesses in Europe. All businesses need access to clean, affordable energy, to finance, to skills, to single market, to trade opportunities, etc. The last thing we would want to do is to shield them from fair competition or innovation pressure. But then you also have a couple of actors, sectors, like the energy intensive or hard to abate sectors, that won't make it through this transition on their own without some kind of support. And that's where we really need an industrial strategy. I believe Kirsten will talk about the Accelerator Act, which we actually called for in our communication on 2040, where we talked about an industrial decarbonisation deal. The President has coined this into a clean industry deal. But let me be very clear. This industry strategy can only be European. It does not make sense to have such an industry strategy with funding at national level. We really have to find the right ways to do this from a European level. And then, of course, there will be a big debate about funding. We have, with the Innovation Fund that you mentioned, had some very good experience now, very insightful. I'll be happy to share some lessons if there is interest in this, where we show the power and the potential of doing things in a single market, also for industry.
Thank you, Kurt. And I think this very last message extremely well aligns with what Draghi said yesterday at the Parliament. He made this important speech to stress some of the key points of the report, but also to clarify some others. And I think one of the clarifying points concern indeed state aid. And he said yesterday, we do need to provide possibly more subsidies to our industries, but it's important to do that in a European manner. And there I think the report also indeed mentions the Innovation Fund and auctions as a service as one of the ways to also fast track, if you want, competition policy procedures and really allow Europe to get simpler and better at this. So thank you for that. And I will now move to you, Kerstin, if possible. You have been on the lead of the Net Zero Industry Act, and you might now be asked to basically do a Net Zero Industry Act for energy-intensive industries. Now, what do you think are the challenges that these industries are facing in Europe? And what can an act like the accelerator do for them in order to allow them to flourish and scale?
Thank you. I would like to be a bit broader than only the act, because we're still kind of scoping. What I want to bring to the debate is a different angle, complementary to what you said, but a different angle, which is that of a business case. Because when you talk about competitiveness, that's a macro notion. What it is actually the sum of many successful business cases where investment is rewarded. It's as simple as that. And any business case, energy intensive or other, you know, it's normally 6 things: access to inputs, access to energy, access to process, technology, access to people, access to funding, access to market. If you have that aligned, then you have a good business case. And this is really where Critical Raw Materials Act and Net Zero Act, being, you know, the new generation single market legislation, started. Access to the things. Now, the business case of the transition, I'm afraid to say, is not a good business case, because you have 3 risks for any company transiting. The first is redemption risk. I have my installation, but, and maybe I haven't written it off, and now I have to do a new installation, a new process. The second risk is innovation risk, because I will have to change my process and introduce a new innovative process to produce, you know, steel with hydrogen rather than coking coal. So there is an innovation risk, also what investors don't like. And then there's a third risk, the market risk. Will people buy my product? Because it's new, they don't recognize it, because it's too expensive. Typically the case of green steel. And then, of course, around this is a more general risk, because I will need new inputs for my process and I will need electricity for my inputs, and the volatility of these 2 prices I'm not used to handle. So investors will also ask a question. So the real question for me and the Accelerator Act will be how to make the business case of the transition a good business case. If you look at cement, glass, steel, refining, chemicals, the business case of the transition will cost to the tune of 1.7 trillion. Steel, I was at the National Steel Summit in Germany on Monday, 31 billion capex and 54 billion opex, because green steel is much more expensive than, you know, there's a delta of 600 euro per ton with imported steel. Chemicals, we have a current investment gap of 12.5 billion per year. Cement, 94 billion. So what the accelerator actually should do is to accelerate the access to story. So access to permitting. We dealt with it for clean tech production, supply side, but we haven't dealt in Net Zero Industry Act with the uptake side. And there's a lot that can be done. Monday, you know, just, you know, to be able to install or to build a direct reduction tower, you know, easily 3-4 years or more. That's not a business case for investors. Then there's the access to market, and that is the lead markets. What is the tools that we can use to create a market perspective for these new products from the start? There is, of course, the rules that we can use, the product regulation, construction product regulation, end of life, the battery regulation. That's one thing. We can use rules. we can also use the public procurement rules. Because, you know, if you look at steel, half of the steel is used in the construction sector. Who is building? Public authorities are building. They are building bridges, they are building roads, they are renovating public buildings. So if part of that demand could be geared to these new green products, following green standards, being visible, also distinguishable, then we have a market, and that reduces, as you remember, my market risk. And we will be reforming. Will be one of the big legislative chantiers for DG Grow, reforming the public procurement rules. And then there's what we are trying on nickel, because some of you may have seen it, but I have a premium market in my pocket here. If I find it. No, I don't. Well, sorry. I think I left it on my desk. So I have a piece of nickel, green nickel. And China is currently destroying completely the nickel market because flooding the market with dirty nickel, very dirty nickel. And lots of nickel mines are closing. Now we're working at G7 level at a response to this. And one response would be to say, let's aggregate our demand on nickel, because nickel is for stainless steel, so the whole energy, wind towers, one wind tower is 1,000 tons of steel. And also in the defense area, pool the demand between the US, Japan, Australia, Canada, and make sure that it's quoted as green nickel. And we have the same standard for it. With that, we create a real market perspective for this particular lead market. Then there is access to funding. And the funding, I don't like the word funding, I prefer the word de-risking. Because there's so much where private money can come in. If you take this bottle, you know, if this is the money that the private sector would be able to do, we have to look at this part of the risk, which private sector is not taking. Okay, then public money has to come in. But public money should not just come in as a grant. We have to look at the type of risk, because some risks you can guarantee with less money than actually they cost. And it's by taking that risk, you can actually attract more private capital. And the problem is that today everybody does it, you know, a bit. So we have to align public money here. That's where the IPSAs are working. That's where InvestEU could play a role, because member states can put their money into InvestEU and increase the sum. That's where auction as a service could work, because member states can chip in with their own money into these auctions. And that means aligning and de-risking at a single market scale. Last point on access to materials and feedstocks. Hydrogen is a case in point. 50% of the hydrogen we need is for feedstock and 50% for energy. Now, with the Hydrogen Alliance, we're scaling up and we are creating these new, reliable, sustainable supply chains for this type of material. Last word on the Critical Raw Materials Act. I cannot not say a word about it because we are very proud of this. So in the Critical Raw Materials Act, we also have this access to permitting, access to funding, access to skills, access to market. On the access to funding, we have the strategic projects. Now, we launched the call for strategic projects, and we thought, maybe 30, if we're lucky, 50. We got 170 proposals for strategic projects, which means there is an appetite in actually investing in raw materials, in sustainable and resilient raw material supply chains. And the proposals, which we are now evaluating, but they range across the whole value chain. So extraction, refining, recycling, they come from almost all member states. And they also a big chunk comes from our partner countries with whom we have critical raw material partnerships, which is the kind of precursor for the clean deal partnerships, which is all based on the business case, supply and offtake. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerstin, and thank you for laying out so clearly what can be done in this sector, but we understand this is really way broader, and the access to strategy to set the right framework condition. Voilà the nickel. Okay, so is the way to go. So thank you for this. And we listen to the clean side of the story, the industrial side of the story. Now we need you to get the deal done. So we have the clean industrial deal covered. Now, you have been one of the most vocal voices, I think, over the last few years here around the need for Europe to ramp up its industrial policy. Do you think this is the right moment? Are we doing this game now seriously?
Yeah.
Floor is yours.
So thank you so much. As you know, before I speak about the future, I like to go back. And I think what's important to understand is that sort of deindustrialization in Europe is not a recent phenomenon. I mean, this has been going on for some time. But what is noteworthy is that since 2022 and the war in Ukraine and our existential energy crisis, that we've really seen an acceleration of deindustrialization. So, and I think it's honestly not an exaggeration to say today that Europe is really sort of at a tipping point. And if I look at just the news in the last couple of days, I mean, it gives cause to concern. I'm sure everyone here followed what's happening at Volkswagen. For the first time ever, Volkswagen is actually speaking now about shutting down plants. We have a clean tech champion, Northvolt. Northvolt is laying off workers, is delaying the production of batteries. Just yesterday, Intel announced that it will not be building a gigafactory in Germany. This despite a whopping 10 billion euro subsidy, right? So if I was still in my old job in political strategy, I would honestly advise policymakers and also you, Kurt and Carsten, to take all this very seriously and to understand that it will, frankly, I mean, it'll take a lot of hard work, sustained focus, and also a lot of confidence-building measures to convince what is by now, I think, is fair to say, a very skeptical business and investment community that Europe can still manufacture at scale, whether it's clean or brown, I mean, frankly, and that we can do so at competitive prices and with digital standards that the world has come to expect. So, in other words, and you're asking me, so the clean industrial deal honestly couldn't be more timely. And if I had to boil this all down to you know, what is the central challenge? It is scale or fail moment. Having sort of just world-class research or small demonstration projects just doesn't cut it anymore. Boldly announcing the world's most ambitious targets doesn't impress anyone anymore. And calling for 800 billion in annual spending elicits disbelief that such a goal can, or maybe even should, ever be reached. So what should happen now? And here I want to divide my remarks between sort of internal and external perspectives, because I think this is really important. So internally, we need an approach to innovation that really takes account and responsibility, not just account, but responsibility for the entire innovation cycle. I am tired of hearing we're so good at R&D, but let me tell you, we have been catastrophically weak in scaling and commercialization. And let me tell you, it's not only startups that cannot scale and commercialize in Europe. This is also true for some of our biggest and most important companies. And I think, honestly, that's an embarrassment for a place that claims to have the world's biggest single market. And I can assure you that completing the single market, that would be the ultimate confidence-building measure that we would like to see. And it would certainly do more than any amount of subsidies or joint debt. So the single market is key. Secondly, we have simply piled too much onto our companies. From the world's highest taxes, compliance, energy, labor, and non-wage labor costs to a frankly constantly changing regulatory environment where the corporate sustainability due diligence directive was really the ultimate own goal for a place that wants to restore its competitiveness. Since we are, by our own doing, no longer cost competitive, we now need to prioritize lowering costs, not just lowering costs of energy, but lowering costs across the board. So this can be done through standardization, faster permitting, also digitalization is key. We need to lower complexity. If Draghi says, Europe puts forward 13,000 pieces of legislation versus the US 3,000, then this is just not proportionate, right? I mean, and to think that because you have more regulation, you're doing something better, it's just a fallacy. You slow things down. So we need better regulation, and we need to credibly also explain now how we plan to make Europe an attractive investment destination again. This is really urgent. The investment agenda has really very much fallen off the agenda. It needs to come back. Speaking about investment, we need to find strategies that will help us crowd in private finance. Kerstin was absolutely right about this. And I would like to advocate for blended finance vehicles. We have one, it's called the EU Catalyst Partnership, which Breakthrough Energy is doing together with the Commission and the EIB. So I think, in this blended finance vehicle, it invests in first-of-a-kind projects that can help de-risk and scale emerging clean technologies. I think we need more of these blended finance vehicles. So not just more grants and subsidies, but really blended finance. In addition to these traditional sources of finance, we need to specifically tap into new sources. And here I want to point to institutional investors, especially insurance and pension funds, or even private wealth, such as family offices. Even philanthropic organizations or foundations, such as the Novo Nordisk Foundation, should become part of this effort. Why? Because this kind of capital is patient capital, and for the energy transition, you need a lot of patient capital. And with a little bit of tweaks, I think we can make this patient capital also more risk-tolerant capital, which is in the area in which I work. Emerging clean technologies, absolutely critical. We need more patient, more risk-tolerant capital. So smart industrial policy must really leverage and mobilize these kinds of capital, but it can only do that if we have a compelling business and investment case. That was already said. And I'm sorry to say, that has been missing from the Green Deal, so this is something we must do better now. And to be clear, policymakers so often believe this is just about more subsidies. It is not. No amount of subsidies is convincing if there's not a credible prospect of a dynamic and growing market on the other side. So that's why focusing on Europe's broader business environment and innovation ecosystem should be considered part and parcel of climate and clean energy policy. Lastly, we need new infrastructure, and lots of it. This lies squarely in the responsibility of the public sector, which broadly speaking has not delivered. We are trying to push people into electric vehicles before we have the corresponding charging infrastructure. We want to make renewables the backbone of our power system, but we have processed permits at a snail's pace. And even though we know that wind and solar are intermittent, we have neglected to draw up strategies for storage technologies, and we have only prioritized the grid very, very recently. And if we make binding for industry to decarbonize by 2030, then we also need to make it binding for the public sector to ensure that we have the necessary infrastructure to underpin such a goal, namely the required upgrade and expansion of the power grid, hydrogen pipelines, abundant and affordable green electricity. Because without that, industry cannot decarbonize. So the clean industrial deal needs to put much more onus on the public sector than the Green Deal ever did. So much for internal policies. Just very quickly on external policies. Starting immediately, we must view the EU not through a Europe in Europe lens, but a Europe in the world lens. And what you will see is we are a declining share of global GDP, less than 15%. You see a consistent loss of global share in manufacturing. Today we're around 14% of global manufacturing, and you will see fewer and fewer of the most valuable companies in the world are European. At the turn of the century, 41 of those companies were European. Today we're down to 15. And against this backdrop, I argue that we need much better aligned trade, competition, and industrial policy. To date, they have been disjointed, and we paid a heavy price for it. For years, we have kept markets wide open for subsidized products from third countries, and one in particular, while not meeting that same level of openness in other markets. And at the same time, our competition policy viewed companies through a Europe lens and enforced strict aid controls, state aid controls. So in a nutshell, we saddled our own companies with the highest cost and regulatory burdens. We didn't allow them to be subsidized, and then sent them into battle, including in our own home market, with companies that don't face the same cost and that don't face the same regulatory burdens, and they are often subsidized and even coddled by their own governments. We then issued procurement rules that mandate that contracts go to the lowest bidder. No, this is just changing now. This is just changing now. By the way, that is true for Europe and outside of Europe, where a lot of what we did with ODA went not to European companies. We can speak about it in a moment. If we today wake up and we find out that we are no longer cost competitive and have basically priced ourselves out of the market, including our own market, if we complain about an unlevel playing field that we to a large part have created ourselves, then we have no one other than ourselves to blame. So in the next mandate, we need aligned trade, competition, and industrial policies, and we must stop, starting immediately, to treat our own companies worse than their foreign competitors. Also, all the growth markets of the world are outside of Europe. We therefore need to use the Global Gateway and similar programs at national level, as well as EIB Global and national promotional banks, to also advance our economic and industrial interests. For example, at COP29, the world made a pledge to triple renewables, very much at the behest of Europe. Why hasn't it occurred to anyone that this is now the perfect opportunity to help our homegrown European wind industry to make inroads into other parts of the world? We know that European wind is high quality, was produced with high labor standards. I hope we still care about this, that we can trust their cybersecurity, and we know that blades can be recycled. I think this is how you create standards and you bring European technologies into the world. So I think we need more of these kind of examples. And to wrap up, I just want to repeat something that I heard at a conference a few months ago. An economy of service is an economy of servants. If we don't want Europe to end up as a museum, we really need to act now, and we need to make the clean industrial deal a success. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I think you raised a number of points. We will react now to one of them. I just wanted to say that I particularly appreciated your reference to the importance of the grids. 2 weeks ago, we had Teresa Ribera at our annual meetings exactly to discuss this specific item. We knew it would be very specific for a, let's say, generalistic event, but to us, grids is a fundamental component of what needs to be a very strong new electrification plan for Europe. We often say that electricity is the main pathway for the green transition, but if you look at the share of electricity in the final energy consumption, that has been stocked at around 20-25% for quite some time, and we really need to increase that very strongly, very strongly, if we are to meet our objectives for 2030 and 2050. Also, appreciated you mentioning the word smart industrial policy, also based on the work we have done on the tracker. We are working on this smart industrial policy stream. We started with solar panels a few months ago, soon a new study on electric vehicles, because what you need here is granularity. And that's exactly, again, what Draghi said. There are no black and white solutions when it comes to green industrial policy and industrial policy in general, and in the report and also yesterday, you have this categorization of those industries where it might be very difficult for Europe to catch up, and therefore we need to have a open trade in order to take the benefit of deploying cheap technologies, reference to solar panels, while at the same time trying to diversify our supply chains for the resilience objectives. But at the same time, we need to recognize those industries where we have a comparative advantage, and we need to double down our support and create the right framework conditions like the wind industry. Now, my question to you all would be, who picks these sectors? Because the fundamental question at the very bottom of all this discussion here is smart industrial policy is composed of horizontal actions, framework conditions, the access to agenda that you put forward. Absolutely, that's the key, as you also said. But then I understand we also want to go more vertical. And therefore, if we want to go more vertical, we need to basically pick sectors, and how to do that in a way that avoids the failures of industrial policy we have seen in the past all around the world, and how to do that in a way that favors competition in the market as well. So I think that's one important question at the core of this discussion. I don't know if any of you wants to react, but then I would also let Kerstin maybe react to the point raised by Anne, if you wish.
Yes, thank you. First of all, Anne, for me it's scale and prevail. So not your tagline. I want to say a word on the investment story, on the permitting story, and on the public procurement story. On the investment story, yes, risk-tolerant capital, we need that. But for years, we've waited for capital market union to happen, kind of miraculously. In fact, we're trying to work on the other side of the capital market union, not this institutional thing, but how to de-risk in a way that institutional investors come in. Example, 300 million. Okay, small ticket, but still. Under InvestEU, we do 300 million testing asymmetric risk-taking with investors. So we share the risk, but at a certain stage, we cap, and it's for us, and they take the benefits, more or less. I mean, you could say that's really a great deal. Now, what we came up against is that this is not actually recognized in our financial services regulation, so we have to change that as well. But, there is the possibility to start actually finding these models. We have a proposal on the table on what we call the ECPAS, the European Societies for, that is your foundation point, to give them a legal form to act inside and outside the EU, and also to make their capital, including their endowments, more risk tolerant. That's a lot of money, and it's a lot of money that actually builds on an ecosystem where people know about innovation and how to bring it up. Second point about the investment story is, if you look at the EU budget today, what we see is that we spend 30% on TRL 1 and 2, more or less, so the very early innovation stage. And then we spend 60% behind TRL 9, so actually just for buying the stuff. In the middle, there is a big hole, and there is nothing. And I would suggest that's a bad investment of the 30%, because these 30% to kind of do something, they go to the US or somewhere else. So we really need to think about how we construct our next EU budget and to think about the investment journey. And that is the competitiveness fund idea. Permitting story, I only want to say, we harmonized, on the back of 30 years of subsidiarity, don't touch my administration, we harmonized the permitting procedures for clean tech across the entire EU. So if I'm an investor and I want to invest in solar panels, I know that the permitting process will be exactly the same wherever I want to invest in Europe. This is a revolution. And it's a permitting process that's state of the art. You don't get that anywhere in the world. Full digital, single contact point, clear deadlines. We didn't totally get the guillotine. If you don't hear from me, then it's approved. But we will try this again. And now we're building containers, digital containers for member states to use, because member states say, oh my God, I don't know how to start with this. So we're building digital containers, which we give to them to organize it in a digital basis. We're doing it with the Netherlands, who have the first, have been. And then on the public procurement, we don't impose the cheapest. It's possible under our legislation, and I know this because with Michel Barnier at the time, we revised the rules to allow to take non-price criteria in. But the 350,000 public authorities don't do it because they say, oh my God, I only do this once. How often do I buy an electric bus? So, I don't want litigation. Go for the cheapest price. And that's what we have to change. And this is where actually our reform will start. It will start not with a system, but with a business case of the managing authority to understand their needs, their constraints, and then build the rules around
this.
And
by the way, if I may, I think Enrico Letta had a very good proposal into the report about how to train the public administrations to get ready at using qualitative criteria in public procurement, because otherwise, if you don't face these root causes of the problem, we are not going to make it, right? So
and obviously the criteria have to be the same,
exactly.
But this is where my point about the market and the standards come in, green steel standard. If everybody uses the same, wow, that's a market.
Kurt, did you want to jump in?
No, happy to react. There is so much in what Anne was saying. It shows the scale of the task we have ahead of us. But I think what I also hear is that we now need to stay the course on this decarbonisation agenda. There's no way back. The worst thing we would do is to slow down. But I agree with everyone who says that we now need to complement this with the business case. That is absolutely true. And we need to make sure that there is indeed a return, a perspective of return on investment and a market in the future. I believe this also means for all of us in Europe, not just the European Commission, but everyone, that we need a different way of public-private cooperation and more orchestration at European level. This cannot be done anymore in silos of 27 member states or even more regions. I believe we have the right policy mix for getting there by making sure there is a price put on carbon, that we come with regulation there where the market needs it, and often business operators are asking for it. Where we probably fail for the moment is in the funding or the finance or the investment that is really needed. That is where we have a very big gap. And it's indeed, I would say it differently maybe, but it's the same thing. What I read in Draghi's report is to say you innovate and invest or you decline. That's basically what we need to do. Now, the investment we need to mobilize to succeed in this decarbonization with a business case is very big, but not unprecedented. If we compare ourselves with China, Europe's investment is 20% of our GDP. China is 40%. I don't think anyone would say that we need to go to Chinese levels. But if we go to 25%, which is what Mr. Draghi is proposing, then actually we would do what we had in the 1970s in terms of investment levels. So this is doable. But it doesn't mean that we probably will have to all the time consistently follow the principle of cost efficiency. That we are not hampered by political or national ideologies or short-sighted interests. That is really the political conundrum we currently have. Cost efficiency for me means keeping regulatory stability. Yes, we need to alleviate, simplify where we can, but you know as well as I do on that simplifying is probably the most complex task we have ahead. We could go on for a long time about regulation, but you know, bureaucrats like us in the Commission, it's not that we like a lot of regulation. We are not paid by the number of articles we put in the law.
That's not a KPI.
But it's not a KPI for us at all. But very often, after each article or behind each article, there is a sector, a business interest that wants this and needs this for its investment predictability. And getting rid of all this, and I understand that accumulating all this becomes massive for companies, but there's always a reason and a motivation behind it. There should be no complacency. We will be under very hard pressure for more leadership in the Commission to simplify, but doing this without touching the investor certainty and the regulatory stability will be difficult. Second point is for cost efficiency, de-risking. I fully agree with Kerstin. The public budgets will not be able to carry all this. There will be a return on investment if we manage to take away the uncertainty, but we can also do this by sharing the risk with the private sector that is happy to do or willing to consider this investment. So de-risking is the big name of the game. I think it also means that we need an all-of-technology approach. We can no longer close our eyes to technological options that we need and that may be difficult for some to accept. For us in the climate policy, this means carbon removals, for example. Carbon capture and storage will have to be big and present. If you look at the mission letter of Mr. Hoekstra, there are 2 paragraphs on creating a single market for CO2 capture, transport, storage and use. So we need massive scale up in the next decade for this, also to go to negative emissions. But it also means, for example, that we cannot stay silent anymore on the role of nuclear energy in the future, for example. That is also something we have to discuss, but always on the principle of cost efficiency. Thinking that we invest now in nuclear reactors to have cheap electricity in 10 years' time is a non-starter. It's renewables that are currently the most cost efficient that we have to ramp up without any hesitation. But we cannot afford not to invest in the nuclear energy that we will need in the future as well. We need an all-of-economy approach, which means all sectors need to contribute, including the hard-to-abate sectors. But it's for those, because you asked the question about the sectors, it's for those that we need a real industrial strategy at European level, including funding. That funding needs to be, I wouldn't say maybe pooled, but at least orchestrated at European level. And that's where the IPCIs, if we can make them very quick and efficient, can play a role. We believe even more in the potential of auctions as a service, where we have shown with our renewable hydrogen auction that we can make hydrogen very cost competitive. Just for people who have not followed this, we were thinking that we would need to subsidize renewable hydrogen production at around 4 to 4.5 euros per kilo. We will now, thanks to the competition in the at European scale, subsidize it at 0.5 euro per kilogram. So we have shown that renewable hydrogen can be very cost competitive in Europe. But a very important lesson we learned is that most of these bids were granted to operators in Spain, Portugal, and Finland, Norway, because that's where the renewable energy endowments are. What we know here is that certain member states complain that they didn't get a project from this auction. It would be so cost inefficient if we now start to fund production of renewable hydrogen in member states where there is no endowment of such renewable energy. But what of course is needed is that we have the right interconnections between north and south to the industrial heartlands. That would be a very cost-efficient way of working. And then lastly, just to conclude, I think the problem I have with competitiveness, and don't misunderstand me, competitiveness is very important. It's an existential indicator for how we're doing. But let's not mistake it for competition and trying to protect ourselves from competition. The worst thing we could do is now to frankly look at how we can protect ourselves from China, from the United States, etc. We need to find our own model of growth, innovation, and investment. And for that, I believe the circular economy is the next
and this
frontier.
is also what Draghi says yesterday. He said this is not a protectionist report. We do need China in a number of these technologies. We only have 5 minutes. And I would still like to collect at least a couple of questions in the room and then 1 or 2 online. So if we can go here to the front, Frédéric, Simon, and then
Thank
Federica
you.
there.
Frédéric Simon for Carbon Pulse. There was this emphasis on lowering energy prices for industry, which seems to be quite consensual. I'd like to have your views on how you think this can be achieved in this mandate. And we've heard some among the energy intensive industries call for a reform of the wholesale electricity market. Do you believe this is something that will be necessary?
Yeah. We have Federica there. A mic is coming so that online they can hear you.
Federica from Politico. So one question similar to the one of Frederic. So you spoke about the need of cost efficiency and the fact that we don't need to let ourselves be hampered by political or national ideologies. And so I wonder if you think that the reform of the electricity market design was a lost opportunity in the previous mandate. And the second one is for Catherine. You spoke about the importance of developing lead markets. Could you tell us a little bit more how are these talks proceeding within the G7 and how do they interact with the climate clubs? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We should have also invited the Director General of DG Ener at this point to discuss market design, but then it will be a DG meeting, and so that wouldn't be feasible. So anyone wants to touch upon the electricity market design point? Are we going to get another reform this mandate?
I don't know if we will get another reform, but we now have a reform of the electricity market. The best thing Europe can do is to make sure that there is an integrated electricity market. Bruegel itself has estimated that simply by better integrating, we can lower electricity costs by 20%. We also have to see what is happening in the electricity prices. These are much lower now in Spain, for example, than in Germany. Normally, with an electricity market, you would equalize these prices. So there's still a lot of work to be done to make sure that there is this integrated electricity market. Secondly, the new reform of the electricity market design holds big potential through power purchase agreements and contracts for difference. Let's maximize the use of this to the fullest, including for energy intensive sectors that really need cheap access to cheap low carbon energy. Third point, we have already said in a communication in April this year that we probably should look at how we better spread the cost of investment in grids and storage and other infrastructure. For example, looking at, again, the tariff model. And I believe Mr. Draghi also says that there should be, or maybe we should consider, a more European harmonized approach to tariffs and taxes on energy, especially for those sectors that are exposed to fierce international competition and unlevel playing field because of difference in energy prices. I think these are very worthwhile proposals that we should discuss.
And the energy taxation directive revision has been there forever, never happened, and maybe now having taxation also under climate might lead to something.
Well, Simone, we are extremely happy that taxation comes under the Climate Commissioner. That is a breakthrough for us. As you know, we like to tax.
Or at least to harmonize.
That was a joke, huh?
Quote. No. Anne?
Picking sectors. And I think the idea that we here in Brussels would know, what sectors to pick is wrong. So there isn't one size fits all. We're not going to be able to tell industry this is how you decarbonize. They will know that themselves, right? And there we need to listen. I can say from my experience, there has been enormous interest in clean electric heat. We have several portfolio companies in this space and long duration energy storage. But someone needs to pay attention then to that there is this interest on the side of industry. And these technologies, very important to understand, they tend to come out of startups. So startups tend to be at the clean technology frontier, But industry needs these technologies. So what I would encourage the Commission to do is not to have one policy for industry and one for startups, but really look at this interplay between startups and industry much more than we have done in the past. I have an initiative on this. I can tell you this is very fruitful. And really the onus is on the policymaker to know what the technology frontier is. Because unless you know where the clean technology frontier lies, you cannot regulate for it. You cannot fund it. So please be interested in the technologies that are in the pipeline. This cannot work otherwise.
That's great. And Kirsten, maybe a final word also to you, as I'm mindful of time, and if you want to react on anything that has been said, and if you might want to touch upon the issue of workers, how to bring workers on board, because that is, I think, an extremely important point.
I wanted to react to that question.
That's
actually.
Great, thank you.
And it was great on Monday, this steel summit in Duisburg, where everybody was present. And this is, you need to make this a joint thing. And we have in our Critical Raw Materials Act and Net Zero Industry Act the Skills Academies, which is a new approach to actually helping people to transform and to transform into these new jobs, to learn to think in modules. What is the competence I need on top of what I already have, which is in particular for industries in transition very important. We have the transition pathways, which is an exercise between regions, governments, but also industry and workers to define, the destiny and where they want to go and who has to do what. We have the Skills Pact. They're all new formats of this. What Kurt, you said, was the public-private cooperation. Because in the past, the state organizes the schools. It was not kind of connected. And I think Europe is a very good platform, not only to connect these sides across our industrial ecosystems, but also to show the best practices, how the cooperation between employers and workers around a specific project can actually work, and how we can also help to finance this and de-risk some of the cost. The Skills Academies, they're an example actually worldwide, and hundreds of thousands of people will be trained through this in a collective effort.
Thank you all so much. I think it was a very useful event, at least to me, to understand better the complexity of this endeavor of forging a new clean industrial deal, but also interesting to get this idea that this will have to really be a team work at the Commission level. We have said forever that we need to abate silos, right? So finally, seems that we are really progressing in that direction, and we can always only wish the best to the Commission to be successful in this endeavor, because again, as we said at the beginning, this is really ultimately, together with the social pillar, I think, of the transition, what will make or break the political viability of our European Green Deal. So thank you to the three of you again for being with us today, and thank you all for listening in and being with us today. Thank you so much. See you soon.